Hi everyone, this is Professor Hernandez and I'm using this video lecture to discuss the ethics essay and specifically how you can revise your final draft, since I know most of you have already completed your preliminary draft. In this presentation, I'm going to discuss the following topics. First, we're going to go over what an argumentative essay is, because that's the type of essay that you'll be writing for this assignment. And we'll also discuss how you can apply the 5 ethical tests. We'll also discuss how you can use logic in your writing, and lastly, how your essay should be structured. Like I said, first we're going to begin with a discussion of an academic argument. Some of you may have written an argumentative essay before, either in another class or perhaps at your high school, or if you attended another university. And just to review, for those of you that already know, an argumentative essay is an essay that's evidence-based. So in other words, you're going to create an argument, and that argument will need to have support or evidence to prove its point. And you really want to focus on defending whichever position it is you take with this essay. So if you look at the essay instructions, you'll see that I'm asking you to take a position on whether or not you feel Ike Libby is ethically responsible for assisting the Hartfords. And your position is going to be the basis for your thesis statement. For this essay, I would recommend that you pick one position. I know that you might take a look at the article and feel that you could argue both sides, but for the purposes of this assignment, it would be much more effective to argue whether you feel he is ethically responsible or not. And like I said, that's going to form the basis for your thesis statement. And in an argumentative essay, your thesis statement is the foundation for your paper. Then the evidence you provide in the rest of the essay, that should support your thesis. For this assignment, you're going to use the evidence that is presented in the article itself and also apply the 5 ethical tests to support your position. So like I mentioned in the previous slide, your position is going to be whether or not you feel Libby is ethically responsible for assisting the Hartfords. And you want to state this position early in your essay, and it needs to be clear to me and whoever else is reading your paper which position you are taking. And a little bit later in this presentation, I'll talk about essay structure and where your thesis statement should appear. But you want to make sure that your position comes early in the essay, so whether or not you feel Libby is ethically responsible. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, you do want to be clear that you are saying he either is ethically responsible or not. You don't want to take a "it depends" position, because then your paper might look like it's all over the place, or your argument might not be as sound as if you took one position. And keep in mind that when we're talking about ethical responsibility here, we're discussing whether or not he's responsible from a business ethics perspective. And I'll discuss this in more detail coming up. But you just want to keep that in mind. We're not talking about, is he ethically responsible as a person, but rather as a businessman. And finally, like I mentioned before, you want to reinforce your position throughout the essay. And when I say that, I mean you want to continuously prove your position and have support or evidence for that position. A lot of students will make the mistake of merely repeating their position or their thesis statement over and over. So when I read their essay, they keep stating, Ike Libby is responsible, he is responsible, but they don't move the discussion forward and explain why he's responsible, or they don't fully apply the 5 ethical tests to show me that these are the reasons why he is ethically responsible. So make sure that you don't fall into that trap. As you can see, and I'm really emphasizing this point, the evidence that you use is very important when you're writing this type of essay because it provides support for your position. Like I mentioned in the previous slide, don't just merely repeat your thesis statement over and over. Move the discussion forward, and each body paragraph should be used in this way. A good way to think about it is proving why that is. So keep the word because in mind. Ike Libby is ethically responsible because A, B, and C, or he is not ethically responsible because A, B, and C. For this essay, the evidence you're going to use is going to come from the article itself, and this is why such a close reading of the article is important. You might also want to read the article more than once because there could be things that you don't pick up on or you don't notice in your first reading. So I would recommend reading the article at least 3 times before you revise your essay if you didn't do that the first time. And picking up on evidence that can be used to support your position. When you discuss the article in your essay, you can use either direct quotes or you can paraphrase the material. And the difference between a direct quote and a paraphrase is that with a direct quote, you're taking the words verbatim. So if you have a quote from the article and you're using the exact wording, you want to make sure you indicate that is a direct quote by the use of quotation marks. If you're putting a quote into your own words or you're summarizing a point from the article, then that would be a paraphrase. Either way, whichever form you use, whether it's a direct quote or paraphrase, you want to make sure to have an in-text citation. And if you go to the Purdue OWL website, you can find information on how to format an in-text citation. I'm assuming for a lot of you, that's something you learned already if you took a freshman writing class, for instance. So I'm not going to go into detail here, but if you need a refresher, the Purdue OWL site is a really good resource for that. And you do not need to do any sort of outside research for this essay. Just use the evidence that's presented in the article itself. Lastly, the evidence that you use is going to be applied to the 5 ethical tests. And that's really going to help support your position because you're going to use a very logical structure to show why you feel Libby is ethically responsible or not. So next we're going to talk about the 5 ethical tests in more detail and how you can apply those to your argument. The 5 ethical tests are in the assigned readings. So again, I'm not going to go into too much detail about what they are. You should read those on your own. But just to review, these are the 5 ethical tests you'll be applying in this essay. So first, the severity of the harm, the certainty of harm, the degree of involvement, the cost of acting, and finally, the certainty of solution. So I'm going to go through each one and explain in reference to the article how these can be applied. The severity of harm has to do with how severe, in this case, is the potential harm that could come to the Hartfords. And again, use the article itself for the evidence. So we know from the article that this couple, they live in Maine, where it gets very cold in the winter. We know that their house is without proper insulation or heating. And we know that they very heavily depend on this heating oil to heat their home. So those are all examples of evidence I found just from the article itself. And now we're going to use that evidence to assess the severity of the harm that could come to them. And in this case, you want to think about how severe can the harm be. So it can go anywhere from, there's some mild discomfort that they could experience because they will be very cold in their home. If you've ever lived somewhere that's poorly insulated, especially during the winter time, you might be able to relate to this, although perhaps you haven't lived in temperatures that are as cold as it gets there. But if you've ever been without heat, for example, during winter, then you know just how uncomfortable this can be. We also know more evidence from the article that this is an older couple, one of them is disabled, and their old age does put them at risk for more physical problems from the cold. They could get very sick, and if they already have an illness, that can be further exacerbated by the lack of heat. Now we're getting into the more severe possible scenarios. They could risk hypothermia if the house gets cold enough. But before you use this in your argument, make sure that you know exactly how cold it needs to be for someone to be at risk of hypothermia. And of course, the most extreme worst case scenario could be death. And again, I want to caution you, because we are structuring a logical argument here. Before you state in your argument that the severity of the harm is potential death, make sure you know exactly how likely this is to occur. And that leads us to the certainty of harm. So we could say, yes, potentially the harm could be so severe that the Hartfords could die. But we want to take a step back and consider how likely or how certain is that to happen. We know that it's very likely they will be cold and they will be uncomfortable in their home because the temperature outside is cold. They don't have proper insulation. They might not have any sort of heating source if they don't get the heating oil. And we could even argue, based on the evidence from the article, that the physical problems which could occur are very likely. Once you move beyond that, though, keep in mind it gets harder and harder to prove. And that's what makes a logical argument, is an argument that can be proven with evidence. What evidence is there that they will die from the cold, that it will be so extreme that this couple is put at risk for death? I'm not saying it's impossible, but before you jump to that conclusion, before you make that part of your argument, you want to consider how likely it is to happen. Next, we come to the degree of involvement. So keep in mind, we're focused on whether or not Libby is ethically responsible for assisting this couple. And in order to assess his level of responsibility, we need to consider how closely involved he is in the situation that the Hartfords find themselves in. And when it comes to this assignment, I've seen students argue this point one of two ways. They could say he's very involved because his business supplies the heat and oil that they need to keep warm. The article also mentions that it's a small town, and his company, Hometown Energy, provides heating oil for most of the residents in that town. So you could make the argument that his business is the only business nearby, or the only one in a reasonable range that provides the product they need. So therefore, he is heavily involved in this. On the flip side, you want to go a step further and consider how involved is he in their financial situation, because that's really the crux of the problem here. The problem isn't that his company has heating oil and the Hartfords can't get to it. The problem is that they don't have the finances to purchase the oil. And again, using evidence from the article, if we're looking at their financial situation, we know that they're already behind on previous deliveries. They're racking up quite a debt to him. And his business is in trouble because he has a habit of giving away his product for free. So again, we're looking at this from a business ethics perspective. And you want to ask yourself, is a business owner ethically responsible to provide their product or services to a customer that cannot afford it? And we'll discuss this more when we talk about logic at the end of the presentation, but that's where a lot of students have trouble, is separating out the emotional aspect of this argument from the logical. So again, just keep in mind, we're discussing this from a business ethics perspective. And if that's the context through which we're constructing our arguments, you do want to ask yourself, how involved is he in their finances and even their personal lives? Because you could make an argument that he does have some type of involvement, being that he provides a product which they need, and he's the closest person to them with that product. But again, keep in mind that the Hartfords are in this situation because they don't have the finances that they need to purchase the product, and whether or not Libby is at fault for that. Now, when it comes to the cost of acting, you're assessing the cost on Libby's part, because again, we're talking about his level of ethical responsibility. So when you're making your argument as to whether or not he should assist the Hartfords, you want to consider, if he does help them or if he doesn't, what's the cost of acting? So if he does help the Hartfords, at what cost does it come to his business, his other employees, and also his other customers? If he doesn't act, then what are the costs there? And I'm not trying to steer you towards a particular answer. And with any ethical dilemma, you should be able to see both sides. And there's no easy answer solution. It's going to be complicated, especially because we're talking about people, and mostly everyone has at least a little compassion. So it depends what your position is and how well you can prove that position. If you feel very strongly that the cost of Libby acting is going to benefit the Hartfords, and it will benefit them more than what it will cost his business or his employees, then that's a position you'll take. As long as you can prove your argument and present a sound argument using evidence, then you'll have an effective essay. The certainty of the solution. This applies to what Libby's actions are. So you want to think about both scenarios. So if he does help the Hartfords yet again, how certain is this in terms of a solution? You could say it's a very effective short-term solution. The Hartfords will have heating oil. They'll be able to heat their home. They won't be at risk for sickness, at least not from the colds. Again, they are very old, so they could catch another sickness not related to this. And potentially they won't die from hypothermia. They won't freeze to death. You also want to ask yourself, how effective of a solution is this in the long term? Again, looking at their history, we know they have a pattern of not being able to make their payments. We know that they've asked him repeatedly to have the heating oil for free, and they promise to pay him back, but they're not able to. So if he provides a product for free, yet again, how do we know that in the long term this is sustainable, or that they're not going to be in the situation again where they need yet another delivery and they still haven't been able to pay for the previous one? So now that we've discussed briefly how the 5 ethical tests can be applied, we're also going to talk about how you can use logic to structure your argument. And this is taken from the Purdue OWL site. I provided a link in the assignment instructions, so make sure to read this section in the Purdue OWL. Really briefly though, I want to talk about the difference between a non-logical versus a logical argument. So first, keep in mind that an illogical and a non-logical argument are not the same thing. An illogical argument is an argument that's completely false and cannot be proven in any way and would not be stated by any reasonable person. So an illogical argument is not the same as a non-logical argument. An illogical argument should be avoided at all costs, especially with this type of assignment. What a lot of students will do, and I mentioned this earlier, is they'll form a non-logical argument that's primarily based on emotion. And again, this is a situation where it can be difficult to put your emotions aside because you are talking about an elderly couple that cannot heat their home. And we know from the article that even Libby has a hard time with this, and not just with the Hartfords, but other customers that can't pay their bills. It really wears on him to the point that he's even taking anti-anxiety medication. However, for this type of essay, you do want to set those emotions aside, and you don't want to build an argument that's based entirely on emotion, because this is an exercise in logic, and this is something that is going to help you when writing these types of essays in other classes. So your essay needs to be based primarily on logic, and you want to have an argument, like I stated before, that's proven by evidence. And you want to show in a very logical manner if you feel he is ethically responsible or not. These are the reasons why. And applying the 5 ethical tests to further prove your point. With this type of essay, I also see a lot of students using logical fallacies. And again, on the Purdue ELS site, they have a whole section on logical fallacies, so you can read more about them there. For those of you that are not aware, a fallacy is, it's an error in reasoning, and a lot of students commit fallacies when they think they're being logical, but they're actually not. And the main reason for this is because there's a lack of evidence. The most common fallacy I see with this assignment is a circular argument. In other words, students will keep restating their point or their thesis statement rather than actually proving it. So this is where evidence comes into play, and this is why providing support for your position is so important. And the second bullet point on the bottom there is an example of a circular argument. So someone might think they're moving the discussion forward when actually they're just kind of repeating themselves. So if you say something like, Libby is ethically responsible because it's his job, that doesn't prove to me, or that doesn't explain why he's ethically responsible or not. A better way to construct your argument would be, for instance, to say he is ethically responsible because the potential of the severity of the harm, or because the certainty of harm that can come to the Hartfords, or, you know, if he does assist the Hartfords, A, B, and C could happen. So you want to give reasons to support your argument rather than just restating it. So now that we've talked about the content of your essay, or what should go into the essay itself, let's talk about a good way to structure this type of essay. Some of you might have used a similar structure in other classes before, and it doesn't have to be very complicated. You could use a basic essay structure for this type of assignment. So you have your introduction, and the introduction should really be no more than a paragraph. Make sure that it's a paragraph and not an entire page, because I see that happen a lot with this assignment. And in the introduction, you just want to introduce the topic and provide the context for your essay. A good way to do this is to give a very, very brief summary of the article. Make sure that the summary doesn't go on and on. You don't have to go into a whole lot of detail. Your summary should not be a page or more. You want to keep it very brief. So just briefly, what is the article about? What's the ethical dilemma that the reader needs to be familiar with before your argument can make sense to them? And you want to include your thesis statement or your position in the introduction. So like I said earlier, whatever position you take, you want to make sure that it's stated clearly and it's stated early on. The body paragraphs, and I'm not going to set a limit or give you a minimum or maximum because I've seen quite a range, and I think it depends on how you write and what you have to say. The body paragraphs are the paragraphs that come in the middle, and this is where you'll discuss your evidence and your support for your argument. And this is also where I should see a discussion of the 5 ethical tests. Now, keep in mind, because there are 5 ethical tests, this doesn't necessarily mean you have to have 5 body paragraphs. You might have more to say about some of the ethical tests than others. So that's why I'm not going to give you any type of limit. Just see where your argument goes and use a space that you need. So it depends on, again, how much you have to say, how much evidence you can find from the article, and how well developed each section needs to be. You can also include the counter argument in your body paragraphs. You can have one paragraph based on the counter argument. It could come after the introduction. It can come before the conclusion. It's not required. However, if you do include a counter argument, this does show a level of sophistication on your part in terms of critical thinking. So if you want to address a counter argument, you can. Lastly, you want to make sure your essay has a conclusion. Like the introduction, the conclusion does not have to be long. It can be 1 paragraph. Most students will just restate their position and have sort of, one last thought. This is why he is responsible or not. If you want to go beyond that, you can offer a solution. Some students might also look ahead and think about, what the possible outcome would be in the future, what's going to happen to the Hartfords. But if you don't want to do either of those, then just very simply restating your position is enough. And like I said, the conclusion does not have to be long. So that is all for now. I hope this video lecture helped clarify this assignment and also helped give you some ideas for the final draft. So again, I know that most of you have composed your preliminary draft by now, but this is a good time to read your peers' feedback, take it into consideration, and also, as I said on Canvas, it wouldn't be a bad idea to meet with a writing tutor. That way you get some additional feedback on your essay, and hopefully that can make your final draft even stronger. So if you have any questions, feel free to email me through Canvas or post your question in the Q&A forum. Thanks for watching, and I look forward to reading your essays.